Hi there, welcome to video 14 in our flipped classroom series. In today's video we are going to now look at the years following the Great Depression. In this video we are really going to focus on the years leading up to World War II, the actual years at war, and then the subsequent years that followed World War II. In today's lesson we actually have three essential questions. The first is which political groups emerged after the Great Depression? Secondly, what was Canada's role in World War II? And the last essential question is how did World War II impact Canada's society? In order to show me that you can successfully answer those questions, please be reminded of our success criteria, which are I can indicate the position of the majority of French Canadians during conscription in World War II. I can identify the major impacts in society after World War II, and as well I can identify the key players in the affirmation of nationhood. So those are your success criteria, and this is video 14, and let's get started. During the Great Depression, the federal government received quite a bit of criticism for its inability to effectively help out and support those in need. As a result of that, new federal parties emerged. Some examples include the Communist Party of Canada, Socialist Party, the Populist Party, and the Fascist Party. These federal parties were not particularly popular in Canada, specifically in Quebec. In fact, the one that really rang true for most Quebecers was a renewed nationalist ideology. Basically what that meant is that French-Canadian people wanted to preserve their heritage, and so they began to really identify with very traditional nationalist ideologies. In fact, these preoccupations were reflected in the provincial political party, a party called the Union Nationale, which was founded in 1935 in Quebec. That following year, its leader, Maurice Duplessis, who used to be a conservative, became its leader. His mission was to defend the interests of French Canadians against threats to French values. In fact, this premier considered agriculture to be the basis of Quebec's economy, and so he was really pushing to further develop Quebec's agriculture for a number of reasons. He thought that it was important to invest money into it, to modernize it, as he felt that that agriculture was going to be the way for Quebec to regain some stability and to regain a little bit of economic prosperity. A few movements actually emerged in reaction to Duplessis' traditional values in Quebec. Such was the case for feminist groups who fought for, among other things, their right to vote. Also, there was movements at that time going on in regards to education. Traditionalist values would have suggested that only the most elite people in society would have been able to afford or gain a university education. But in fact, at that time, people began to say that we needed to open up access to education and scientific knowledge to everyone in society. What is very important to note is that all of this was going on at a time during the Great Depression where things economically and socially were not very good. While all these movements were taking place, the economy was still in shambles and was about to get itself a huge boost as a result of one of the most iconic and important moments in history. In Germany, Adolf Hitler's Nazi Party rose to power in 1933. Hitler's expansionist designs plunged Europe into the Second World War, and Canada, as a member of the British Commonwealth, reached out to assist Great Britain, and it entered the war against Germany in September of 1939. Canada's participation led to profound changes throughout its society. Nearly 1 million soldiers, sailors, pilots, and Canadian auxiliaries took part in the World War. About 42,000 lost their lives and 53,000 were wounded. As for the Royal Canadian Air Force, it had close to 250,000 members in British Air Force. Perhaps the most profound change in Canadian society was felt in its economy during the Second World War. Between 1939 and 1942, Great Britain and its allied countries suffered many defeats on the European continent. Canadian Prime Minister William Lyon Mackenzie King decided to do whatever was necessary to come to the aid of its allied troops. Therefore, in 1939, his federal government enacted the War Measures Act, which gave it the power to organize the country's economy. This now meant that the government was going to encourage its workers to take jobs in businesses that were participating in the war effort, as well as to take the provinces to cede their taxation money and revenue to finance the war industry. The production of food, weapons, clothing, and military equipment helped to boost Canada's economy following the Great Depression. While the economy was bolstered, another way that the population was taking part in the war effort was through rations that were put on staple products like things like gasoline, sugar, coffee, tea, butter, and meat. In addition, the population was strongly encouraged to bolster their savings by purchasing victory bonds. All the funds that were collected enabled the government to finance the war effort. The unemployment rate decreased quickly during the war, and most unemployed people enlisted in the army or worked in the war industry. Women were also called on to take part in the war effort, particularly by rationing and collecting recoverable materials. From 1942 on, women worked in war factories to make up for the labor force shortage. It's estimated that these women numbered more than 265,000 in 1944. Finally, the Canadian government gave in to pressure from women's movements and asked women to join the Canadian Women's Army Corps. Female employees and workers received less money than men for the same work. Nevertheless, they found that employment allowed them to improve the quality of their lives, and it gave them greater financial autonomy or independence. After the war, some of them decided to stay in their new jobs and demanded greater equity in job allocation and salary. However, most female employees were fired to make jobs for the soldiers who had just come home from war. Similar to World War I, during World War II there was once again a conscription crisis. At the start of the war, the federal government promised not to impose conscription, contrary to what had happened during the First World War. Meanwhile, the Allies greatly needed soldiers, and some English Canadians were ready to enlist. In 1942, the government organized a referendum, and it asked its population to allow to renegotiate its once made promise. During that referendum, 63.7% of Canada said yes to conscription, while only 28.8% said yes in Quebec. The majority of English Canadians obviously agreed with conscription. However, French Canadians strongly disagreed, and this conscription issue once again led to greater tensions between the two groups, and it encouraged the gathering of nationalist forces in Quebec. Finally, though, starting in 1944, the federal government did, in fact, resort to conscription, and nearly 13,000 conscripts were sent abroad. By April of 1945, Allied forces began to take large numbers of Axis prisoners. The war was essentially signaled to an end with the death of Italian dictator Benito Mussolini, as well as the death of Adolf Hitler. Adolf Hitler committed suicide in a bunker a day after many German forces ultimately surrendered. In 1945, soldiers began to return to Canada, where they found many changes had occurred within Canadian society. In 1940, when the war was going on, women were granted the right to vote in provincial elections. In addition, in 1943, the adoption of the Act respecting compulsory school attendance was passed on, making school compulsory or mandatory for people up until the age of 14. Other things that were passed along that time was the creation of the Quebec Hydroelectric Commission. And so while war was going on over in Europe, these changes occurred all throughout Canada. In the years that followed World War II, there began to be a number of changes in society. One of the large changes that happened was the very popular baby boom and immigration growth between 1946 and 1960. Approximately 135,000 infants were born each year in Quebec alone. So this strong hike in the birth rate, known as the baby boom, increased the population of Quebec by about 65% from 1945 to 1970. The baby boom was also it also lowered the average age of the population. So in 1951, a quarter of the population was under the age of 10. The government thus had to consider building new schools and universities and supplying pediatric care. Another thing that was happening at that time was that immigration was also an important factor in the increase of the province's population. Between 1945 and 1960, approximately 400,000 immigrants settled in Quebec. Immigrants were drawn to Quebec by the strong demand for workers in the industry and by the low unemployment rate. Thanks for watching video 14 in our Flipped Classroom series. Before I let you go, I just want to remind you of our essential questions and success criteria for today. So our first one was which political groups emerged following the Great Depression? Second, you had to be able to answer what was Canada's role in World War II and how did World War II impact Canadian society. Our success criteria were to indicate the positions of French Canadians regarding conscription in World War II. Also, you had to evaluate the impact that World War II had on Canadian society. And finally, you had to be able to describe the emergence of nationhood or further nationhood in Quebec. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you again soon. Bye-bye.